let's talk needles and thread. So when you start your project, you're going to want to make sure you have all of the threads that you need. Your pattern will tell you what colors I have used in the sampler, all the different DMC floss colors that you'll need. When you buy them from the store, they come in skeins like this. They have a number on the label that tells you what color they are, so you make sure that you're getting the right ones. When you get your skein, there are two loose ends. There's a long loose end and a short loose end. When you go to pull your thread out of your skein, make sure you start with the long end. They're wound in there so that they can smoothly come out just layer after layer, but if you grab the short end, you're gonna wind up with a great big knot. So start with the long end and pull your thread out. Now, you can keep your thread in these skeins like this. As you pull it, you see that the labels stay in place and it holds it. But as you use up more of the skein of floss, those labels get loose and they tend to fall off. And then one, you can't remember what color it is. And also they tend to knot up and get tangled. So in order to solve that, I like to use just clothespins, and I will take my skein of floss and just wrap it around it until the whole skein is on here. And then I make sure that on the bottom of my clothespin, I just use a regular ballpoint pen and I write the number of the color that it is so that I always have it for reference when I'm pulling colors for a project if there's specific colors I'm looking for. So once you have your thread ready, you don't have to use clothespins. There's little cards that you can get and store them in little organizer boxes. There's lots of different ways to store your thread, but I recommend doing anything but leave it in the skein just because they tend to knot up and you'll end up with a great big ball of mystery floss. So let's get ready to thread our needle. The first thing that we're gonna do is pull a piece of thread. Now when I'm pulling thread, for my projects, I try to keep the length of my thread about the length of my arm. It just gives it a manageable size, one that creates a lot less knots, a lot less twisting. It's easier to separate the threads. It is a little bit short when you're working on large spaces, and if you feel like you're comfortable with it, you can go a little bit longer. But I find as a general rule, it's really easy to manage a piece of thread that's about the length of your arm. And one note that I was going to show with these clothespins that makes it nice is when you go to cut your thread, there's enough give in the pin, even with it's wrapped with a full skein of yarn, that you can open it up, and I just slide the end of my thread through to pinch it, and then I'll cut off the piece of thread that I need. And that way my loose end is always available in the clothespin and I don't end up unwinding my whole skein of yarn. So once you have your thread cut, we're going to want to thread our needle. Now, with this specific color, I know I'm going to be using all 6 strands and leaving it like it is. So I want to choose an embroidery needle that has a larger eye because I want to make sure that I have enough room to get all of those strands of floss through. And this is where using a needle threader is both good and bad because you have to make sure that you have an eye big enough for 12 strands of floss because the needle threader folds it over and then you have to pull all of that through. Where if you're going the old-fashioned spit and determination method, you're only getting 6 strands through. So sometimes you can get that through a little bit smaller eye. Now, especially with the projects that we're doing and when you're using 6 full strands, the reason that you would want a smaller needle with a smaller eye is so that you can work in some finer details with less threads. But because we're already using lots of threads, we know that a big needle isn't going to interfere with our ability to create the details that we want. So to use this needle threader, what you're going to do is take this wire loop and you're going to put it right through the eye of your needle. Then you'll take the end of your thread and you're going to put it through the wire loop so that it's hanging right there, and you just need a little section, just enough so that as you're trying to pull it and work it through the eye, that you're not gonna pull it completely out of your loop again and have to start over. So then I pull my needle towards the thread, but when I'm getting closer to my thread, what I like to do is turn my needle threader so that my thread is coming in parallel to the eye of the needle, and it just helps make it smoother so that you're not pulling directly against all of those threads. Because when you have this really thin wire right here And sometimes it takes a little energy to pull the thread through the eye. If you get too aggressive with it, sometimes you can actually cut some of your threads with this needle threader, and you don't want to do that because you don't want loose threads. So then I pull off my needle threader, and then I'll have a short end and a long end to my thread. Now, you're only going to use one of these to stitch with, but you don't necessarily need a whole section that's free to stitch with. So what I like to do is pull this short end so that the single part is a little bit shorter, and that just makes it easier so that when you're going up and down with your stitches, you have a little less range of motion that's required of you when it's folded over like that. Now, sometimes you're going to be stitching and the pattern's going to say only use 3 strands of floss instead of all 6. When you get to that point, there's some tricks you're going to want to know to make you not want to pull your hair out when you're pulling threads. So I've cut this piece a little bit short on purpose so that it's easier to demonstrate how to separate the threads. When you look closely at embroidery floss, there are 6 separate strands. And I'm going to try to just fan them out a little bit there so that you can see there's a bunch of different threads in there. So in order to separate those one strand at a time, you're going to take one individual thread, and while you're still pinching the whole strand with your 2 fingers on your left hand, with your right hand, or opposite if you're different, you're going to pull just the single strand. Now you'll see that the rest of the strand is curling up, and you're going to panic and you're going to think you're going to have a great big knot. Just trust me on this and just let it go. Just keep pulling until it's all the way out, and then you'll see that this other strand just falls straight back out. Now, the other thing I want to point out when you're pulling your threads is I like to hold it up just from the end and let the thread just hang loose, because there's some twisting as the threads are put together into the strands of floss, and you want to get as much of that rotation and stuff out. And sometimes I'll even just run it through my fingers really quick to make sure it's flat and not twisted. So when and then you'll just go back to your strand, you'll pull another single strand, and sometimes that's hard to get just one. Again, just pinching it with your fingers, pulling it through, and then you just let it fall. But you can see that there's some twisting going on. So I will straighten this out and lay it down next to it, and then straighten this back out before I pull the next one. Now, on our pattern that we're making this stitching sampler, often we're using either 6 strands or we're using 3 strands. So when I'm separating a strand of floss, I typically will just go through and separate all of the strands. And that way, when I finish sewing with the first half of that skein, then I have my second half ready to go and I don't have to separate more threads. So I'll just pull all 6 of them apart, and then I'll set 3 aside for later, and then I'll take my 3 and thread them in my needle. So what you do when you have all 3 of your strands is you've just set them down, and you have ends. Some are short, some are long. So you want to make sure that you bring all of your ends up so that they're even with each other. And I will just, sometimes I use my finger and I'll just pinch those 2 together and then slide it. Bring the other one up so that they're all 3 lined up. See if I can get them all to cooperate with me. And then I'll pinch my 3 that are lined up, and then you can see that they're not all even with each other. So I'll just run my fingers down, and because I took the time to make sure there's no twisting and stuff, they don't wrap on each other, they just lay next to each other. So then, because we're using less thread with this one than we did with the last one, we can use a little bit smaller needle, but we're going to thread it just the same way. You're going to take your needle, you're going to put it through the eye, put your thread through the wire loop, and you want to make sure, because these are a little bit looser, that you get all 3 strands through that loop so that you're threading it with all of the strands that you really intend to stitch with, and then pull it through and pull off your threader, and now you're ready to go. Now you can either knot your thread here, and one way I like to knot my thread is I will take the loose end and pinch it between my 2 fingers. I'll wrap the thread around so that the loose end is being pinched between my 2 fingers, and then you just roll it off of your finger and then slide it to the end while you're still pinching it, and then it's a knot. So your loose end has wrapped around, and now you have a little knot at the end of your thread. Sometimes when you're stitching, depending on what your finished project is going to be, you want to not have knots on the back, because if you're going to mount it onto something, you want to make sure that the back is as smooth as you can make it. So when we get to stitching, I'll show you how to stitch without making knots. But for this project where we're leaving it in the hoop, it's not really going to matter. And sometimes it's just nice to have that knot and you can get stitching right away. So now that we have our needles threaded, let's get stitching.